Welcome to the Times Arrow podcast. I'm your host, Alan Guy Wilcox. We are here with the poet Philip Memmer on the occasion of the publication of his new volume of verse, CAIRNS, out from Lost Horse Press. Philip is the author of 6 collections of verse, including Pantheon, Thread of Pleasure, and Storehouses of the Snow. Thank you for being us. Welcome, Phil.
Sure, thank you. Glad to be here. Or is that a funny thing to say when you're in your own house?
Thank you for letting us in.
I'm still glad to be here.
I appreciate you trusting us in your space. So there's a lot of ground that I hope we can cover in this conversation. Certainly your life as a poet and your work as an educator and a publisher and an editor. But I thought maybe we could begin a little bit with your upbringing and a sense for how you were formed as a reader and a writer.
Sure. As a kid, I was always a voracious reader. Go to the library, bring back 20 books, and go back 2 days later for another 20 books, and growing up, never necessarily thought about being a writer much. It wasn't really an ambition. And it wasn't until I was in college that I ever actually tried creative writing in any real way. I was a musician in high school and, played keyboards in bands and was writing really terrible song lyrics. And so a couple of buddies of mine took a poetry class at the University of North Carolina and said, hey, you should give this a try. It was really fun. We think you'd have a great time. And I thought, maybe I would write better song lyrics if I took a little poetry. And the teacher of that workshop, a wonderful woman named Hillary Holliday, who is a professor and an academic now, author of several critical works and a novel as well, brought in the first day of class poems by Lucille Clifton, Stanley Kunitz, and Wallace Stevens. And that was it. I had never read even contemporary-ish poetry, let alone poetry by living poets, and was just sort of immediately hooked, both by all these new voices I was hearing and these new ways of writing poems that I'd never encountered as a high school or middle school student, and also then the puzzle of trying to do it myself. So that's really how I got started. Not a typical origin story, I guess. A lot of us, I'm not the poet who was scribbling in my notebook at midnight with a flashlight, or anything like that. I came to it not terribly late, but later than many.
You mentioned those 3 poets who are obviously, colossal figures in the history, especially of 20th century American poetry. Were there certain forebears who became models for your own type of verse?
Yeah, I think the first 2 poets I really fell head over heels in love with were Louise Glück and Robert Frost. Wildly different poets from each other, of course, in a lot of ways, and still, among my very favorites. And so many others, of course, along the way. Anne Sexton was also huge for me early on. Bridget McGee Kelly I discovered as a grad student, and still one of my very, very favorite poets in the world. My teachers at the University of North Carolina were also really influential on me. William Harmon, James C., Michael McPhee, all just tremendous poets, all doing very different things, which I at various points tried to replicate in whatever way I could.
There must be something in the water in North Carolina because it produces many great writers.
So many amazing writers, yeah.
To my sensibility, there is an affinity for Louise Glück present in CAIRNS, actually. And I've heard you mention Robert Frost as a poet that you admire, and I admire him enormously. And it's interesting the role that he continues to play in contemporary discourse about poetry, revered in many circles, but many believe him to be, antiquated or a figment of, a bygone era. But it's nice to continue to celebrate his work as a craftsman, but also I think he's a misunderstood poet in many
Very
respects.
much so, yeah. I think that he's a deeply scary poet, right? And I think that one of the things that I've always been attracted to in Frost is the slyness of the work too. That he, it's so much more grim than the surface might lead you to believe, and that, along with the formal invention that is, so ever present in so much of the work, especially in the first, half to 2/3 of his career. I'm just always astounded. Every time I go back to Frost, I find new things to be humbled by.
Sly is very interesting, and I think fit word to select, and a word that isn't normally associated with Frost. But as you get into the biography as well, you see that he was a very kind of canny individual and sly in certain respects, and wheeling and dealing, and always kind of keeping tabs on his popular life and his friend group, and the impact that his poetry was having when and where.
Yeah, he probably paid too much attention to that stuff, probably as a result of being recognized so late. He was pushing 40 when his first book came out, and even then he had to self-publish it. It was not the beginning he had hoped for, and it must be very troubling to be the kind of genius Frost was, to know poetry so thoroughly that he was aware of what he was doing and how important it was, and to just get nowhere with it for so long, right? And to not have it recognized until really Pound started blowing the trumpet for him, and that is, I think that shadow stayed with him throughout the rest of his career. It was kind of never enough. Where if, maybe if his first book had come out when he was in his late 20s or something, maybe he would have felt very differently about it, right? He was a very complicated and troubled man who had a very hard life in a lot of ways, and of course that comes out in the poems too, often very carefully hidden, but it's there.
And sometimes made brutally explicit.
Yes, absolutely.
It's not every poet who selects, for example, a boy's hand to be come off in a sawmill in a poem as fit subject matter for his verse. But I think that's really, I'm excited to get into your poetic work. But just because we're on this for a moment longer, something you said I think spoke to me, which was that word, and I think the veracity of the genius of Frost's work was overshadowed by the modernist environment into which his work, played off.
Right.
And Pound is, of course, an interesting figure there. Obviously, an interesting figure in many ways, and it's interesting to talk about Frost in Clinton, New York, where he since Hamilton College was his alma mater.
Pound's alma mater.
Pound's alma mater. So, anyways, so CAIRNS, maybe here's a segue, is also a work, while it's not necessarily redolent of Frost, it does two things that I think Frost does really well, which is it conveys both a kind of timeless elementalism, and it also plays into very nicely and naturally into kind of our modern idiom. So the work it doesn't require foregrounding to read it. It's kind of instantly accessible and enjoyable, but there's a lot there worthy of being unpacked and discussing. So I guess my first question is, how did you come to this subject matter?
Yeah. I've been writing various other poems, other series of poems that dealt with other mythologies, whether they were Judeo-Christian stories, biblical stories, or other myths, other myth-like things. in my previous few books, and really ever since I started writing poems, this has been something that's kind of been lurking in the background. And one thing that occurred to me after I finished the book before this book, Pantheon, which is a series of dramatic monologues in the voices of various invented god characters, I realized that I've been writing all these stories, using all these myths, and I'd never really, in any serious way, dug into the idea of the afterlife at all. It's present in some of those poems, and there are various places where it pops up, but it's never really the focus in any extended kind of way. And I thought that would be fun to tackle, just as an idea. And I thought about various characters, various stories I might use as an entry point. And of course, what comes to mind, characters like Lazarus or Sisyphus or Tantalus or not Oedipus, Orpheus, and the more I thought about it and, tried to figure out what I might do in that neighborhood, the more and more I liked the idea of playing around with Sisyphus. He's just such a perfect everyman sort of character. The futility of his afterlife is so recognizable, I think, in our own modern lives. And that was something I wanted. I didn't, of course, when I say do something, write something that deals with the afterlife, that's the picture. But of course, ultimately, it's about our lives, or who cares, right? We don't know what the afterlife is. We're all guessing. But our own life, we're always looking for ways to process and looking for avenues for exploration and, hopefully that momentary stay against confusion that Frost, so beautifully spoke of. So even then, though, I had a hard time getting into it. The way I tend to start poems is I get a notion in my head maybe of what I might like to write about in terms of a neighborhood of thought or a character or so on. But I really have to hear that first bit of music before I can get off to the races. And so I go on lots of walks and think and think and think and think. And then eventually something will grab me. And one of those thoughts will turn into a line. And then I can start working with that and push that out. And usually along the way, then what happens also is that initial bit of language suggests a formal structure that I might employ, whether it's a line or a stanza structure, whatever it might be. I love nonce forms. I love to create my own forms and then play around in them. And so that's another part that creeps in. And for this book, with Sisyphus, it was a combination really of hearing the voice of the stone for the first time, not necessarily Sisyphus's voice, but hearing the other side of the conversation, that I said, oh, okay, now I see what I might do with this.
Our viewers and readers will probably be familiar with the tale and the myth of Sisyphus, but I think it would be good to circle back in a moment to that. But before we do so, because you brought up the notion of the afterlife, I just wanted to bring up the fact that you bring us a lot of freshness in our conception of hell. In this verse, there's many things that we might not expect to see there. There's a line, something to the effect of, forgive me for not having it by heart, but, you should be instigating applause, and that there's beauty present, and that's what in part makes it hell.
Yeah.
So this is a very refreshing, and so to kind of tack on to that thought, since you also brought up motion, movement, walking as part of your process, I'd like to think that any bit of writing might be salvageable as a poem, but I more and more, in my experience anyways, I've come to think that knowing how to enter that process and getting that part right is a huge part of the equation. And it seems that you have, really matured a way of getting that process ready for yourself. So I guess my kind of unformed question here is, how much time, how much energy, how many years does it take in order to know what's right for you and what feels like a Philip Memmer poem, if such a thing exists?
It's tricky, and I think that I was having a conversation, this was years ago now, but with the wonderful novelist Dana Spiotta, who teaches at Syracuse University, and we were talking about how, I think in her case it was her third or fourth novel she was working on, and I was working on my third or fourth book of poems, and we were lamenting how we always thought as younger writers that it would get easier, and it gets harder and harder, right? The new books don't get easier to write, they get harder to write, because hopefully it's harder to please yourself the more you learn, the more you work at the craft. The things you would have been satisfied with 10 years ago don't satisfy you now, And I found that to be very true. So, in terms of answering that question, I think for me, I want my work to be accessible to an audience, but of course, our first reader is always ourselves, right? And so I'm trying to write something where I get to the end and my pulse is quickening, or I'm crying, or whatever the emotion is, that it moves myself in a way that Phil Memmer sitting around thinking about stuff doesn't ever do. Right, that's boring. That's just me in my head. But when you put it on paper, or in a word processor screen or whatever you do, and you finally get to the end of a draft and recognize that it's bigger than where you started, that it's that unimaginable. The thing that was unimaginable when you started, right? It's turned into something at the end that you couldn't have anticipated, that it's gone somewhere that you didn't know you knew, That's, for me, that's when I feel like it's done. Mm-hmm. Stephen Dunn has an essay where he, or maybe it was an interview, one of the two, where he says that, that he always, he would start writing and probably at what would be a very high level because he was Stephen Dunn, for crying out loud. But at some point, he would then write the first thing that surprised him and toss out everything that came before that line. And that was where his poem started, because he recognized, okay, now I'm doing something new and exciting. All the other stuff was warm up, right? But here I am writing a poem. And, for me, that's a big part of it. When I finish something and it surprises me on some level, where it took me somewhere. Because if it's doing that for me, it's doing that for the reader, hopefully. That's the idea.
What it sounds like to me as well is that part of what is required, and this obviously would be, custom built in each poet, but that an ability and a tolerance and a willingness and a joy in killing the darlings that come out first, and knowing when the true tap is flowing.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, you have to be ruthless. Absolutely. Any writer, I think, learns that pretty early on. That we all have those great little moments that we thought were so clever or whatever else, and those are usually the first things you cut.
Speaking of ruthless, I think that many people know the basic conceit of the Sisyphus myth, but part of the reason that it hits home is that you've been able to, I think, go back to, I'm imagining a variety of sources, but we don't need those sources in your poetry, but what's still present about them is that Sisyphus is a man. He's not just some cipher or some marionette, and so his fate is coupled with a sense of consequence about how he lived his life. So could you introduce our readers to
So interestingly enough, there's not tons and tons out there. It's not like there's some vast 500-page epic or something, about Sisyphus in the past to draw from. But he's mentioned here and there. He was an actual real person. There was a real guy who was a king in ancient Greece and was a terrible person by all accounts. His various supposed sins included, trying to have or having one of his brothers murdered, seducing one of his nieces, having guests in his home murdered, which is, a very heavy sin for that era. When someone was under your roof, they were supposed to be under your protection, even if they were your enemy.
Hospitality.
Hospitality was, the whole angel unawares thing, which of course, was in the Bible too. This is an old idea and old bad mojo to break that, So, and then, mythology-wise, then his reward for this behavior, along with all that, right, just the normal, actual human sins, mythologically, he also tricked several of the gods in various ways. Kept them captive, imprisoned them, tricked them. He died once and then tricked his way out of the underworld, like all these things, to where he pissed off everybody, essentially. So his reward in Hades ultimately was to push a stone up a mountain, never getting quite to the top, having it roll back down, and then having to do the whole thing over again. Day in and day out, or week in and week out, however long the journey would have taken him. And of course, in art, he's always depicted with this monumental stone, right? That no person, no matter how insanely ripped they are, and of course, he's always wildly overbuilt in those old etchings and paintings and things. But pushing a stone up a mountain that no human could ever move an inch, let alone up a mountain. If you ever pick up a big rock in a garden or a yard or something, like it doesn't take a big stone to make you pretty miserable. Which actually played in when John Fitzsimmons there's a series of etchings in the book by John Fitzsimmons, an artist from Syracuse, and one thing he thought about was exactly that. He represents the stone in his art in the book as a skull, which I thought was a really cool invention of his and sort of perfect for the tone and the conversational aspect of it. But if you had to carry even a stone the size of a skull up a mountain every day, it's a lot of work. That would be probably 30 or 40 pounds of extra weight you're toting around. So,
just briefly, while we're on the topic of John Fitzsimmons, I mean, many kind of questions here, but the book, it's such a beautiful art object, combining the poetry with these incredible etchings, and there's a lot to say about here, but one of them that I wanted to call out in particular, which was striking to me, and I think plays particularly well with a lot of the themes you discuss in the book, is an image of Sisyphus kind of as an old man holding up the skull and conversing to it as he's doing throughout your book, but in a way that conjures instantly kind of the Hamlet with Yorick's skull.
Absolutely.
And it filled me with immense sadness because Hamlet never became old, of course, but still these would be conversations that would never have gone away, and I thought it was incredibly effective, especially where it occurs in the book. So how did you and John meet, and how did you decide to collaborate?
So one of the various things I'm involved with in my role, my full-time job, which is serving as executive director of the arts branch of the YMCA of Central New York, is publishing the journal Stone Canoe. And we've published several of John's paintings over the years. In fact, I forget if it was our 14th or 15th issue, but his was the cover painting for it. And so we were Facebook friends, and the first section of CAIRNS was published in Solstice, an online journal. And I put up a link to it when it came out. And John messaged me and said, hey, if you ever want to collaborate on something, let me know. And I had just been talking with my publisher at Lost Horse Press about the idea of incorporating art into the book in some way. One of the things that I shouldn't say we, because I don't think the publisher was really struggling with it. This was really my own insecurity, but the poems are all very, very short. It's a book that you can read cover to cover in 35 minutes or so, very easily. And then hopefully, of course, you go back and, reread things and go back to the moments that you reacted to the most strongly. But just reading it straight through, it can be read very quickly. So it felt light, right? It felt to me, and this is just a ridiculous capitalist, bit of baggage, that I wasn't giving the book buyer enough for their hard-earned dollar. And so we thought of the idea of including some artwork just to flesh it out a little bit more. And then what John came up with was so beautiful and so such a great addition to the project that I can't imagine the work without it at this point. I sent him the manuscript. We had one meeting really where we talked about the book and his responses to it. What I was looking for, which was not images of guys pushing rocks up hills, which has been done and done and done and done and done, but really more of a parallel journey. And then John went to work, and we met a couple more times. But what he did was just so beautiful. And ultimately there's 11 of his images in the book. The last fun bit of the whole production was him giving me the final 11 images and then me figuring out what order they were going to go in the book, because none of them were designed to go with particular poems or anything. It was really just him riffing off of the text, more in the abstract. And so, puzzling out, the images serve as section dividers, basically. There's groups of 8 poems, 9 groups of 8 poems, and there's an image between each one, and then one at the front and one at the end of the book. So it was great fun sorting out which one would go where and which image had the nicest echo for which section of the book along the way. Between that and then the size of the book, I don't know if it translates here on screen, but it's a tiny little book. You can almost stick it in your back pocket. I forget what the dimensions are, but it's something like 4.5 by 6 or something like that, 4.5 by 6.5. So really, it's cute. It's a cute wee little book about hell. I love that too, that, it's this tiny little book that is full of all this humor, yes, but also, of course, darkness and pain and trauma and so on.
A primer for our youth on
Exactly.
Well, lots to say there. The process that it sounds like John had and then you both had together in your collaboration, first of all, I just think it's a wonderful and kind of trustful way to collaborate, and I just think that more people should explore ways of collaborating in that way, whether it's in art and poetry or in other areas of life. But and I think maybe it would be good in just a moment to have you read a little bit from the book. But one thing I wanted to kind of make mention of is the idea of how you combine burdens with, and you tie that notion together with the notion of love, so that they are inextricable in some sense. When you think about life and burdens, and love is right there too. And one line in particular, among the many that kind of hop out was, can one stone be a cairn? Which comes from the voice of the stone, and that provides a window into, I think, this project of yours in a way, whether that was, at least for me, and then we also see, the discussion of the summit. There's kind of themes of being asleep and being awake, But we also, from John Fitzsimmons' work, get these pyramid structures too, as well as the skull, hugely evocative, and helps us not only see the writing in a new light, but we see the pyramids in a new light, given this new context. Would you read a little for us?
Sure. Was there a particular section you wanted me to read, or should I just pick one? Or what would...
Gosh, there's so many moments, but maybe something from the beginning of the book to help
Sure.
introduce it.
Why don't I read... I'll read the second section of the book.
Terrific.
Sisyphus asks the stone, "Are you awake?" I dreamt, I say, that I pushed a stone up a mountain. I hope I wasn't heavy, the stone replies. It wasn't you, I say. It was some other stone. My fate, some say, is an absurdity. Well, whose isn't? In the ski lift chairs above me, perdition's couples always learn too late they hate each other. There is no snow. They have no skis. Have you seen, the stone asks, how as you labor, our shadow mirrors the meeting of egg and sperm? I'm not your husband, I murmur. But I think of the souls beneath us, and I push. Without someone to bear it, what is a burden anyway? Call me your stone, wails my stone. Sure, stone, I pant, shoving it onward. No, whimpers my stone. I want you to call me your stone. Once, at its request, I stepped in front of the stone, relaxed my long, cramped limbs, and waited for it to push me. And waited. I'm sorry, said the stone. I'd hoped. So did I lied. So did I. The stone falls and comes to rest amidst those souls condemned to watch my failures. Another botch, they sigh and wander off. For my long and dark walk down, nobody stays. No one waits but the stone. So that's a little taste.
Thank you.
Sure.
Many things here, but two I wanted to mention. One is the notion of absurdity that you introduce here. Of course, your book has an epigraph from Albert Camus, and he deals directly with the notion of absurdity in human life as part of his treatment of the myth of Sisyphus and the question of suicide as it pertains to whether we can have a philosophical discussion. But also something that occurred to me there in a more crystallized way than when I'd just read it myself. Really nice hearing your voice was the relationship of Sisyphus and the stone, the conversational, personal interlocution between them sheds a lot of light on, I think, contemporary psychology and how we need things in certain ways and how we need to call them by certain names in order to have them be identified in the way we'd want them to be. I guess my question here is, it's more one of tone. Finding that tone when you're dealing with this heavy material, bringing in your natural humor and a light touch to those moments. I mean, combined with the question of absurdity, I'm going to hand this all over to you as a little basket. But how did you consider this?
I think for part of it's just my own personality, of course, and the things that excite me about what stories can be like, what they can do, how they can work. Part of it is that I realized sort of early on that if there were going to be a ton of these little poems all strung together, they can't all be, traditional hell sorts of things, right? And it would just be impossible to read. Who wants to read 72 pages of that? You need to have various tones breaking things up. But that absurdity was also really important because, of course, it's his absurdity and his situation of having to do this silly thing over and over and over, never having success with it. But it's also our absurdity. And, humor is, of course, a way of coping, too. And I think that here, if the book didn't have that, then the darker moments wouldn't stand out. But when you have that interplay between the two, then you have opportunities to twist the knife, right? And to really get your reader unawares, at moments, right? I think there's places in the book where you can kind of almost forget where we are, and then being able to remind the reader of where they are, where the character is, what they're dealing with, is then that much more rich, right? Unless versus it just being, 72 pages of Inferno, just endless suffering and so on. Even the Inferno has humor in it, right? So it's not like this is a new strategy entirely. For me, I also, the other thing I wanted was, when we think about the myths and we think about things like Hades, we always cast them as if they were 4,000 years ago or 3,000 years ago. But in theory, he's still there pushing his rock up a hill right now while we have cell phones and, laptops and intercontinental ballistic missiles and everything else. So why shouldn't those things be in hell? Why shouldn't there be ski lifts on the mountain that he's pushing his rock up? Why shouldn't there be a Mount Washington style gift shop at the top? All these sorts of things that are both funny, I hope, to the reader, but also then present new opportunities for torture as well, right? Like, no one's happy in that Mount Washington gift shop at the top of the mountain. They're all miserable. This people on the ski lift hate each other. And there's no snow anyway. It's just like that kind of opportunity to play, really, while also reinforcing what the book's about at the same time. I just love that kind of thing.
It's certainly, those are all moments where as a reader, you chuckle and then you go, ooh, all right. Great. And you're bringing to mind Joseph Campbell, well-known comparative mythologist who, introduced at least me, but many others, to the idea that, mythology is kind of a mirror that allows you to see perhaps where you are in your life at that moment and give you some kind of yardstick to measure. Camus, of course, published his book on Sisyphus in the middle of World War II and speaks a little bit about the kind of distortion of eternal values that had, happened in that context. Kind of hazarding this on a lark, but while you mentioned that kind of you had an intuition and an instinct to move in this direction, and that there was something here for you in this subject matter, I'd be interested to know just a little bit about how you see this current moment in time as an educator, as an editor, as a poet, as a father.
Yeah, I mean, it's terrifying, right, in a lot of ways. We have simultaneously technology that as a kid we couldn't have dreamt of, hardly. When I was an elementary school kid in the 70s, cell phones were a distant dream, et cetera. Let alone, I vividly remember going to see the first space shuttle launch, right? And to sort of see where we're at now, where so much of our culture doesn't even pick up a book, are actively anti-intellectual, anti-science, regressive in ways that wouldn't have seemed possible when I was younger. And, I think I think for a lot of us, there is a frustration and pain in that, right? With the absurdity. Where is the Star Trek we were promised, right? This shining future. It's like, well, no, we don't want to do any of that. We want to go back 100 years instead. Why haven't we solved a single problem that has been plaguing people for a very long time? With all the wealth, how do we still have homelessness and so on? And there is an absurdity to that. I think it's a struggle in a lot of ways to continue for a lot of people in the face of that, right? That it's so daunting. It seems so unanswerable. One thing about CAIRNS that I didn't realize until it was done was that really it's a book about trauma in a lot of ways. But writing it, I had no idea that was what it was about. I don't tend to worry about little things like meaning when I'm writing. That comes later in revision, or maybe even in arranging the book ultimately. When I'm writing a poem, I'm thinking about music. I'm thinking about playing with images and metaphor and so on, creating tones, but especially music and voice, and then seeing where it winds up. And it wasn't until the whole thing really sort of started gelling together I said, oh gosh, really, that's what I've been writing about? And I think a lot of that is wrapped up in the book in various, very occluded ways, but a lot of our current cultural moment, a lot of what it is to be a person right now, raising kids in this crazy world, looking at the environment and where we're headed there, all these things that are sort of just like kind of lurking in the wings of the book.
Well, I think one hopeful note that the book strikes is with the very image of a cairn is this sense of leaving behind a memento of saying, I was here, we were here, and that these are beacons or mile markers along the path, and that we can look to one side and look to the other and imagine a way out of the morass.
Yeah. And Sisyphus grows in the book, right? The place he winds up in, despite what we think of as the traditional character, where he just does the exact same thing over and over again, he develops and learns some important things about, I was going to say life, but of course that's not quite it, but about himself, about his relationship with this stone of his. And that was sort of a fun discovery along the way too. I can very vividly remember, spoiler alert, he loses the stone. But I remember when it occurred to me what was going to happen and how, along the way. The book it's super loose as narratives go, but there is a bit of a narrative to it. That was also one of the moments where I said, oh, now I really, I have the framework to hang all these little poems on. Up until that point, they were just these little one-off poems that I knew would all go together in some way, but I had no idea how or in what order or anything. It was, I was just writing them, and letting them pile up. But when that moment occurred in one of the poems, I said, okay, now I understand the shape of it. And that's always a crucial part of writing a book, I think, is the moment, for poetry books particularly, where it goes from being, I've written a bunch of poems, to understanding how they're going to go together. And there used to be a time where, as a poet, you could just sort of take oh, these are the 50 poems I wrote over the past 5 years. And you'd put them out in a book and it would be like, Philip Memmer, Poems, 1910 to 1915. And that was the title of your book, and nobody cared if it did any more than that. But readers these days look for a little more structure, I think. And me as a writer, I look for that structure. You know, I like a book that does something as a whole in addition to as individual parts.
I think that's not surprising, since we are in a very heavily saturated world that is simultaneously mistrustful of certain narrative devices and are continually in search of new meanings being fostered and created. So, look, there's so much we could ask about here and delve into, but among the many things I'd like to talk about, including to talk more about your work with Stone Canoe and the Downtown Writers Center, let me just kind of ask a final kind of coda question about CAIRNS, which is how you found and developed the actual basic structure of the forms that each of the poems is written in. Can you say a word about that?
Yeah, so I love syllabics. A lot of people will tell you they don't really work in English, which is true, if you really pay attention just to syllabics. So what I'm doing really is sort of syllabics heavily infiltrated by more traditional meters along the way. And my last 3 books have all played with syllabics really heavily. Before that I did as well, but really my last 3 have been entirely in syllabics. And so this book, as I was starting to play around, I stumbled across this little form that all these poems are in, where it looks like 2 4-line stanzas, each of those stanzas being 22 or 23 syllables long. Really, I kind of think of them as one line with extra line breaks in the middle of it, just to break up the flow on the page. So really 2 long lines with extra play graphically. They started out as being 22 syllable stanzas, lines, whatever you want to call them. And then I realized at some point that I just needed a little more flexibility. So I started giving myself 1 extra syllable per poem if I needed it. If I didn't need it, great. But if I needed it, I had one teensy little bit of verbal grace to play with. And that made a huge difference, because it meant I wasn't contorting myself terribly much to fit that form. And, 44 syllables is tight, and that was part of for me, the play with syllabics that I like so much is it's such a restriction, and how do you both meet that restriction and also make it sound good, and make it have the kind of music I look for in poems. And so for me, that was really a lot of the pleasure of writing these, was that formal dance. How do I balance the extreme brevity of these teensy little poems? It's a 72 poem book that you can read in a half hour. I mean, those are short poems. They're all like 20-second, 25-second poems. How do you balance that with music? How do you balance that with how they look on the page? And then, of course, having them do something. So that was a lot to manage, and kept me interested, certainly.
Well, it's certainly one of the thrills of reading the book, is knowing that each individual system is a performance in itself, but also carrying on a narrative. Phil, we'd love to talk to you whenever you have a new title out. This was an incredibly satisfying introduction to your body of work. Please stay tuned, because Philip Memmer will read 1 or 2 poems from his previous collections. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for allowing us into your lovely home.
And thanks for being here.
It's a real pleasure. The book is CAIRNS by Philip Memmer. It's out. We'll leave a link in the description below where you can find a copy, out just late last year from Lost Horse Press. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Cheers.
So this is a poem from my previous book, Pantheon, which is it's a collection of dramatic monologues in the voices of various invented god characters. And this one is the god of sky. Because you have always been a model passenger, pretending to watch the pre-flight safety instructions, always willing and able to perform the duties required of those in exit row seats, I leapt into action and removed you from your crashing plane. It was a small thing, the exit door already blown away by the smuggled device, your lap belt unfastened, despite the fact your only sin, the fastened seatbelt sign, was clearly lit. I forgave you and brought you here, the freezing air of 20,000 feet. Whether you're better off than those inside is yours to say. I'm not the god of safety or soft landings. Those still panicking in the doomed fuselage have, along with oxygen masks and seat cushion flotation devices, the same time left that you do, more or less. And they have each other screaming. You have nothing but falling and the wind your falling makes. You're shaking, yes, but you have the horizon at sunset and the earth's curve. And I will stay however long it takes you to flurry through me, if that's all right. How I wish I could be the god of flight, or out of thin air parachutes, or even the god of death, so I could end this. I'm not. There is no god of death, or parachutes, or flight. Just sky. I hope it's a comfort to know that I am with you. I hope it's a comfort to know you're almost flying. And I'll read one from the book before that. This is a book called The Storehouses of the Snow, Psalms, Parables, and Dreams. And it's just what it says on the tin. There's 3 kinds of poems in the book. There's psalms, which are direct addresses to a god character. There's parables, which are narrative poems that pretend to tell some sort of moral lesson at the end. And then the dreams are sort of first-person lyric poems that don't fit tidily into either of those categories. This is one of the parables. Parable. There was a street, and upon it stood 3 vacant houses, and beside them no others, a neighborhood long abandoned. And so one night came thieves, 3 of them. Into the first house the first thief crept, breaking the dirty glass of a cellar window. But there he found no gold, and so empty-handed he left and never returned. And then at the second house, the second thief, knowing no one would hear, drilled out the lock of a side door. But finding there neither silver nor jewels, he too left and did not come back. And so it was the third thief approached the third house. But unlike the others, he broke no glass, destroyed no lock. He simply walked right in. The threshold, like both the others, had long stood open. For a while he explored the rooms, then slept on the floor. At daybreak he tidied the lawn and planted the garden. At noon he mopped the shower and oiled the doors. And then, as the day ended, he took some paint to the mailbox and wrote his name. And like this man, and though you will always be a thief in your heart, you must find the kingdom empty, then make it yours. And I'm going to finish with an old one. This is a poem from my second book. And it's for my old friend Franz Peter Griesmeier, who is a philosophy professor and from Austria. And when one is an Austrian philosophy professor, you wind up having lots of conversations like this in the backyard with a bunch of beers. This poem's called Knowledge. My philosopher friend is explaining again that the bottle of well-chilled beer in my hand might not be a bottle of beer. That the trickle of bottle sweat cooling my palm might not be wet, might not be cool. That in fact it's impossible ever to know if I'm holding a bottle at all. I try to follow his logic, flipping the steaks that are almost certainly hissing over the bed of coals. Coals I'd swear were black at first, then gray, then red. Coals we could spread out and walk on. And why not, I ask, since we'll never be sure if our feet burn, if our souls blister and peel, if our faithlessness is any better or worse a tool than the firewalker's can-do extreme. Exactly, he smiles. Behind the fence, the moon rises, or seems to. Have another. Whatever else is true, the coals feel hotter than ever as the darkness begins to do what darkness does. Another what, I ask.
Thank you for joining us for this special edition of the Times Arrow podcast. If you'd like to enjoy more deep dive literary content like this, make sure to hit the like button, tap the notification bell, hit subscribe, share it with your friends. And if you would like to enact your own literary adventure, come visit us at timesarrow.org. Thanks.